Capitalism. Most people hear that word and think of something permanent, something as natural as gravity or weather. We grow up inside it, work inside it, suffer inside it, dream inside it, and eventually begin to believe there has never been another way for human beings to organize life. But what if that belief itself is the biggest illusion of the modern world? What if the system that dominates almost every corner of our lives is not some unavoidable force of nature, but a carefully constructed machine designed to keep power concentrated in the hands of a few while convincing everyone else that they are free? And what if the people running that machine are terrified that ordinary people might finally realize this? Economist Clara Mattei argues exactly that. She says capitalism survives not because it works for humanity, but because governments, institutions, and economic systems continuously force society to depend on it. According to her, the modern world is not organized around human happiness, health, freedom, or dignity. It is organized around preserving profit. And once you start looking at history through that lens, everything begins to change. The endless pressure to work harder while life becomes more expensive. The constant fear of unemployment. The idea that healthcare, education, housing, and even basic survival must always be tied to wages. The feeling that no matter how advanced society becomes, ordinary people somehow remain exhausted, anxious, and insecure. Mattei says these are not unfortunate side effects of the system. They are features, necessary features, because a population constantly struggling to survive is easier to control than one that is secure, organized, and independent. For centuries, people have been taught that capitalism emerged naturally because it was simply the best system humanity could create. But Mattei challenges that story directly. She says capitalism was born through violence, dispossession, and coercion. One of the clearest examples comes from the enclosure movement in Britain. Before capitalism fully took hold, many communities had access to common land where they could grow food, raise animals, and sustain themselves independently. They were not rich, but they possessed something incredibly dangerous to future capitalist systems: the ability to survive without selling their labor. And according to Mattei, that independence had to be destroyed. Land was privatized. Communities were displaced. People who once had access to shared resources suddenly had no option except wage labor. Work was no longer something people chose freely. It became a condition for survival. This transformed human beings into laborers dependent on markets controlled by elites. And once dependence was created, capitalism could expand. Suddenly, life itself became tied to employment. If you wanted food, shelter, healthcare, or security, you needed wages. If you needed wages, you needed employers. And if you needed employers, employers gained enormous power over your life. That structure still shapes the world today. Even now, millions of people remain trapped in jobs they hate because losing employment could mean losing healthcare, housing, or the ability to feed their families. Freedom becomes conditional. Choice becomes an illusion. The market becomes a master disguised as an opportunity. Mattei argues that one of the biggest myths in modern society is the idea that governments are powerless in the face of economic systems. Politicians constantly claim that painful economic policies are unfortunate necessities. Cuts to social programs are called fiscal responsibility. Wage suppression is framed as economic discipline. Public services are privatized in the name of efficiency. But Mattei says these are not neutral technical decisions. They are political choices designed to protect capitalist structures. And one of the most powerful tools used to maintain those structures is austerity. Most people think austerity means temporary economic hardship during difficult times. Governments cut spending, reduce services, and ask citizens to sacrifice so the economy can recover. But Mattei argues austerity serves a deeper purpose. It weakens collective power and forces people back into dependence on markets. When public healthcare is cut, people become more reliant on employers for insurance. When education becomes expensive, debt pushes people into labor markets they cannot escape. When housing becomes unaffordable, survival requires constant income. According to Mattei, austerity is not a failure of capitalism. It is one of its most effective strategies. Think about how modern societies react whenever workers begin demanding more power. If wages rise too quickly, economists warn about inflation. If unemployment becomes too low, central banks worry workers may gain too much bargaining power. The language sounds technical, but the underlying fear is political. A society where workers are secure enough to reject exploitation threatens systems built on cheap labor and inequality. Mattei points out that mainstream economic models often hide these political realities behind complex formulas and academic language. Poverty is blamed on individuals who supposedly failed to work hard enough. Unemployment is treated as a natural market adjustment rather than evidence of structural inequality. Economic suffering becomes personalized. If you struggle, society tells you it is your fault. You made bad decisions. You lacked discipline. You failed to compete. But Mattei argues this narrative prevents people from seeing the system itself. Because once people recognize that insecurity is being systematically produced, they may begin demanding something entirely different. And perhaps the most unsettling part of her argument is this: capitalism does not merely shape economies. It shapes consciousness. It teaches people how to think. From childhood, we are conditioned to measure human value through productivity, income, and competition. Success becomes linked to wealth accumulation. Failure becomes moralized. People are encouraged to see each other not as members of a shared society but as competitors in an endless race. Even relationships become transactional. Social media turns identity into branding. Education becomes job training. Creativity becomes monetized content. Rest becomes guilt. Human beings begin organizing their entire lives around market logic. And over time, it becomes difficult to imagine another way of living. That, according to Mattei, is one of capitalism's greatest victories, convincing people that there is no alternative. But history tells a very different story. Human societies have organized themselves in countless ways throughout time. Markets existed long before capitalism, but they were not always the center of life. Communities often prioritized collective well-being, shared resources, and social obligations over endless accumulation. The idea that every aspect of existence should revolve around profit is relatively new. Yet today it feels permanent because the system has become so deeply embedded into institutions, media, and culture. Movies celebrate billionaires as visionaries. Politicians praise entrepreneurs as saviors. The wealthy are treated almost like celebrities or kings. Meanwhile, workers are told to be grateful simply for having jobs, no matter how exploitative those jobs become. The psychological effect is profound. Many people begin identifying with systems that actively harm them because they have been taught to see wealth as proof of intelligence, virtue, and superiority. Inequality becomes normalized, even admired. And nowhere is this contradiction more visible than in modern technology. Humanity has created machines capable of automating enormous amounts of labor. Productivity has exploded. Artificial intelligence, robotics, and digital systems could theoretically reduce working hours and improve quality of life for millions. Yet instead of creating more freedom, many people feel more stressed and economically insecure than ever. Why? Because under capitalism, technological advancement primarily serves profit rather than collective liberation. Efficiency gains do not automatically translate into better lives for workers. They often translate into layoffs, surveillance, wage suppression, and greater concentration of wealth. Mattei argues this reveals a fundamental truth about the system. Human needs come second. Profit comes first. If a technology increases profits while making society more unequal, capitalism still considers it successful. Look around today and the evidence feels impossible to ignore. Housing prices soar while millions remain homeless. Food production reaches extraordinary levels while hunger persists. Pharmaceutical companies make billions while essential medicine remains unaffordable for many people. Entire industries profit from human suffering. And despite all this wealth and innovation, governments repeatedly claim there is never enough money for universal healthcare, affordable education, or robust social safety nets. Yet somehow there is always money available for corporate bailouts, military spending, and financial rescues when markets collapse. Mattei says this reveals what states truly prioritize. The system protects capital first and society second. One of the most powerful aspects of Mattei's perspective is her rejection of the idea that capitalism equals freedom. In modern political culture, capitalism and liberty are often presented as inseparable. Markets supposedly represent personal choice. Consumers are told they are free because they can choose between products. But Mattei challenges this definition entirely. Is a person truly free if survival depends on accepting exploitative work? Is someone free if healthcare is inaccessible without employment? Is freedom merely the ability to buy things, or does real freedom require security, dignity, time, and democratic control over the systems shaping everyday life? These questions strike at the heart of modern ideology because they expose how narrow contemporary definitions of freedom have become. And then there is the issue of democracy itself. Many people assume political democracy automatically means economic democracy. But Mattei argues the two are not the same. A society may allow citizens to vote while still leaving enormous economic power concentrated in private hands. Corporations influence legislation, shape media narratives, fund political campaigns, and lobby governments. Billionaires possess more influence over public policy than ordinary citizens. In many ways, economic power becomes political power. And when wealth concentration reaches extreme levels, democracy begins eroding from within. People may technically have voting rights, but real decisions increasingly serve financial elites. This creates frustration, distrust, and alienation. Citizens feel powerless because, in many cases, they are. The system allows participation, but only within limits that do not threaten existing power structures. What makes Mattei's argument particularly compelling is that she does not simply criticize capitalism from a moral perspective. She analyzes how it reproduces itself through institutions and policies. factories. Schools train people for labor markets. Media normalizes consumerism. Economic crises are used to justify austerity and privatization. Fear of unemployment disciplines workers. Debt creates dependence. Even leisure becomes commercialized. The system extends into nearly every aspect of life. And because people spend so much time struggling to survive within it, they rarely have the time or energy to imagine alternatives. Exhaustion itself becomes political. Yet despite the overwhelming power of these systems, Mattei insists change is possible. She argues that one of the first steps is recognizing that capitalism is historically constructed rather than inevitable. If human beings created it, human beings can transform it. That realization alone is radical because it breaks the psychological trap of inevitability. Throughout history, systems once considered permanent eventually collapsed or evolved. Monarchies seemed eternal until revolutions shattered them. Colonial empires appeared invincible until independence movements dismantled them. Feudalism dominated Europe for centuries before giving way to new structures. Every social system presents itself as natural and eternal while it exists. Capitalism is no different. But Mattei does not imagine change arriving through some dramatic overnight revolution led by a single leader or political party. Instead, she focuses on building alternative infrastructures capable of meeting human needs outside purely capitalist logic. Participatory budgeting, community assemblies, cooperative ownership, local food systems, public services organized democratically rather than for profit. These may sound small compared to the scale of global capitalism, but Mattei sees them as essential foundations for broader transformation. Why? Because they allow people to experience different forms of social organization directly. They create spaces where collective decision-making and mutual support become real rather than abstract ideals. And perhaps most importantly, they reduce dependence on systems that profit from insecurity. Imagine communities where housing is treated as a human right rather than an investment vehicle. Imagine healthcare organized around care instead of insurance profits. Imagine education focused on human development instead of producing obedient workers for labor markets. Imagine technological innovation directed toward reducing unnecessary labor rather than maximizing shareholder value. These ideas often get dismissed as unrealistic, but Mattei challenges listeners to ask a deeper question. Unrealistic for whom? Many policies considered impossible for ordinary people become suddenly achievable when elites require rescue during financial crises. Governments that claim they cannot afford social programs somehow mobilize trillions when banks or corporations are threatened. The issue is not simply resources. It is priorities. And this is where the conversation becomes deeply personal. Because capitalism does not only shape institutions, it shapes how people see themselves. Many individuals internalize constant pressure to optimize their lives, increase productivity, and turn every passion into a source of income. Hobbies become side hustles. Rest becomes laziness. Time itself becomes monetized. Even personal identity is increasingly filtered through market value. Social status revolves around wealth, visibility, and economic success. People compare themselves endlessly. Anxiety becomes normalized. Burnout becomes ordinary. Mattei's critique speaks directly to this emotional reality because it asks whether human beings were truly meant to live this way. Were we meant to spend most of our lives trapped between exhaustion and financial fear while a tiny minority accumulates unimaginable wealth? Or have we simply accepted conditions that benefit powerful interests because we have been taught to see them as normal? Perhaps one of the most important themes in Mattei's work is language itself. She argues that capitalism captures and reshapes words to maintain ideological control. Freedom becomes consumer choice. Innovation becomes profit maximization. Efficiency becomes cutting social protections. Even revolution becomes commodified and turned into branding. Reclaiming language, according to Mattei, is essential because words shape imagination. If people cannot even describe alternatives, they struggle to envision them. And if they cannot envision them, they are easier to govern through resignation and cynicism. That is why dominant systems constantly reinforce the idea that there is no alternative. Hopelessness becomes a form of political control, but Mattei rejects hopelessness entirely. She believes ordinary people possess far more power than they realize, especially when they organize collectively. Throughout history, workers, activists, communities, and social movements have repeatedly forced transformative changes that elites once declared impossible. Labor protections, voting rights, civil rights, public healthcare systems, and social safety nets were not gifts from the powerful. They were won through struggle. And those victories reveal something important. Systems change when people stop accepting the boundaries imposed upon them. Still, the challenge today feels enormous. Modern capitalism is global, technologically sophisticated, and deeply intertwined with daily life. Corporations possess immense influence. Algorithms shape public discourse. Media ecosystems amplify division and distraction. Consumer culture encourages constant individualism while weakening collective solidarity. People are isolated even while digitally connected. And yet this isolation may also reveal the system's fragility. Because despite all the promises of endless consumption and technological progress, millions remain deeply dissatisfied. Loneliness rises. Mental health crises spread. Economic insecurity intensifies. Many people sense something is fundamentally wrong even if they cannot fully articulate it. That feeling matters, because systems begin unraveling when increasing numbers of people lose faith in the stories sustaining them. For decades, capitalism justified itself by promising rising living standards and expanding opportunity. But younger generations increasingly face unstable employment, unaffordable housing, crushing debt, and climate anxiety despite being more educated and technologically connected than previous generations. The promise feels broken, and once people begin questioning the legitimacy of the system itself, new political possibilities emerge. Climate change especially exposes capitalism's contradictions in dramatic ways. Scientists warn humanity faces catastrophic environmental consequences if current patterns continue. Yet meaningful action remains painfully slow because addressing the crisis threatens powerful economic interests. Fossil fuel industries continue generating enormous profits while governments hesitate to implement transformative policies. The logic of endless growth collides directly with ecological limits. And this raises an uncomfortable question: can a system built on perpetual expansion ever truly coexist with planetary sustainability? Mattei suggests the answer may be no. If profit remains the highest priority, environmental destruction becomes structurally embedded into the economy. At the same time, crises often create opportunities for change. Economic collapses, pandemics, climate disasters, and social unrest expose weaknesses within existing systems. They reveal which jobs are truly essential. They expose inequalities previously hidden beneath everyday routines. During crises, people frequently rediscover forms of solidarity and mutual aid that contradict the hyper-individualism promoted by capitalist culture. Communities organize food distribution. Neighbors support one another. Workers demand protections. Suddenly, ideas once dismissed as radical begin appearing necessary. The question becomes whether societies use crises to deepen authoritarian control and austerity or to build more democratic and humane alternatives. Mattei warns that elites often exploit crises to reinforce capitalism rather than transform it. Economic emergencies become excuses for privatization, wage cuts, and weakening labor protections. Fear is weaponized. People struggling to survive are less likely to resist. But she also emphasizes that crises can produce the opposite effect if communities organize effectively. Moments of instability reveal that systems are not as permanent as they appear. Rules can change rapidly when pressure intensifies. Policies once considered impossible suddenly become reality. This means political imagination matters enormously. And maybe that is ultimately what Mattei is trying to restore: imagination. The ability to imagine a society beyond endless competition, precarity, and profit obsession. Not a perfect utopia, but a world organized around human needs rather than accumulation for its own sake. A world where healthcare, housing, education, and dignity are treated as rights rather than privileges. A world where democracy extends into economic life instead of stopping at the ballot box. A world where technology reduces suffering instead of concentrating wealth. A world where freedom means more than choosing between products on a shelf. Whether one agrees with all her conclusions or not, Clara Mattei forces listeners to confront uncomfortable realities about the modern world. Why, in an age of unprecedented wealth and technological capability, do so many people remain insecure? Why are societies capable of extraordinary innovation unable to guarantee basic dignity for everyone? Why are workers constantly told to sacrifice while billionaires accumulate fortunes larger than entire nations? Why does economic policy so often protect markets before protecting people? These questions cut through decades of ideological conditioning because they expose the gap between what society could be and what it currently is. And perhaps the most radical idea in all of this is surprisingly simple: the future is not fixed. Systems are made by people. Institutions are maintained by people. Economies operate according to rules designed by people, which means people can redesign them. That possibility terrifies those benefiting from the current order because it undermines the illusion of inevitability. Once people realize there are alternatives, control becomes harder. Resignation weakens. Political imagination expands. For generations, countless individuals have been told to adapt to systems that make them anxious, exhausted, indebted, and insecure. They were told this was realism. They were told suffering was necessary. They were told competition would eventually produce prosperity for everyone. But what if realism actually means recognizing that a society capable of feeding, housing, educating, and caring for all its members already possesses the material capacity to do so? What if the real fantasy is believing endless inequality and instability are sustainable forever? Clara Mattei's message is ultimately both unsettling and hopeful. Unsettling because it challenges assumptions deeply embedded into modern consciousness. Hopeful because it insists that history remains open. Human beings are not trapped inside immutable laws of economics. We are participants in systems we collectively reproduce every day. And if those systems no longer serve humanity, they can be transformed. The first step is refusing to believe that the world as it exists today is the only world possible. Because once that mental barrier breaks, entirely new possibilities begin to emerge.